Okay, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
My name is Evan Weiner, and my background is radio and TV and newspapers and magazines, and I'm too old to do that according to whoever chooses those things to do. But I still like to work putting together stories, and 1891 is a patchwork of stories I put together, and you're going to be kind of surprised that in some ways 1891, 2025, not much different, except 134 years. Benjamin Harrison is the President of the United States. How many of you are aware who Benjamin Harrison is? He's the President. And he's kind of one of these mediocre presidents. Does some good things, but there are some things he can't do. Jim Crow takes root in the South. If you want to vote, well, you got to pay a poll tax to vote. And this is one of Harrison's problems. He didn't want you to do that, but Sheriff's Office, Hinds County, Mississippi, pay the vote if you're an African American. The Immigration Bill of 1891 is signed, enacted by the House of Representatives and Senate of the United States of America in Congress assembled. Following class of aliens shall be excluded from admission to the United States. Anybody here an idiot? Because if you say you're an idiot, they won't let you in. Lynchings are commonplace in the 1890s. There was probably a lynching every other day. It wasn't just African Americans, as you will find out in a few minutes. Lynchings led to the creation of Columbus Day. You're going to say, what? I'll tell you how. Jews are expelled from Moscow. They're told to get out, and they do get out. Some of them ended up in Poland and Western Russia. Some of them ended up in the United States. The U.S. Navy and an incident in Chile. Benjamin Harrison, the president, decides to flex his muscles, and for the first time there is foreign policy edict against another country, this one Chile. American and Indian boarding schools. This is a problem for Native Americans and also for First Nation members in Canada. Send the young people, Native Americans, First Nations, Indians, send them to school, take their names away, take their identity away, and try to westernize them. The Forest Reserve Act. Benjamin Harrison was a conservationist, and he begins to look at land around the United States he does not want touched by business. How many of you think you could go to the movies in 1891? Well, the beginning of the movie industry starts 1891, Edison in the Kinterscope. Carnegie Hall opens. What's the best way to get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. It was not called Carnegie Hall when it opened in 1891. The name would be changed.
Not everybody can get in.
Yeah, well, yeah. Beer and Whiskey League folds. You probably don't know about the American Association of Baseball. You probably don't know much about blue laws in the country and drinking alcohol in the country. So this kind of goes hand in hand with the American Association failing, and they were dismissed as the Beer and Whiskey League, sort of a put down by the National League owners, saying, they're nothing but a Beer and Whiskey League. They play games on Sundays. You shouldn't play games on Sundays. Basketball was invented December 15th, 1891. The original basketball was a soccer ball, and they put peach baskets up. And if you got the ball in the basket, somebody went up there to get the basket out, the ball out, and you had another tip-off, and that's how the game was played. Oh, by the way, the city of Pittsburgh loses its H at the end of its name. 1891. All the burgs that had an H at the end of their name, the government stripped them of their H. And it got people in Pittsburgh rather mad, as you look at modern day Pittsburgh there with my wife. So what does Benjamin Harrison's America look like? If you ever thought what America was like for your grandparents? How many of you had grandparents in America in 1891? Came afterwards. Well, the immigration is beginning to start. The changes in immigration. 1882, there's the Chinese Exclusion Act throwing Chinese out of America. And there's more and more and more of a push to basically get the immigrants out because it's changing the demographics of the country. So this is Benjamin Harrison's America. Your great-grandparents' America, if they were here. President Benjamin Harrison's America wrestled with issues about economic policy, which includes that word tariffs. Ever hear of that word tariffs?
Yes.
Yeah, well, there were the 1890 tariffs, and people in 1891 are not very happy paying a lot more money for about 1,500 items that were imported. The flux of immigrants, does that sound familiar? Immigration. And the deeply entrenched racism against various ethnic and racial groups. Ethnic, I'm going to talk about that because of an incident in 1891. You have Columbus Day today. The Congressman William McKinley, the McKinley Tariff Act of 1890 took full effect. Full effect. This act significantly raised tariffs on imported goods to almost 50% on average. The tariff's main aim was to protect American industries and workers from foreign competition, but it jacked up prices as Americans were paying import duties, not companies or other countries. It's American consumers that are all of a sudden paying more for products, not as promised. American companies, they're just passing it on to you. There was anti-immigration sentiment known as nativism, fueled by fears that immigrants would take jobs, threaten the cultural dominance of Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and introduce radical ideologies. The Harrison presidency saw the systematic implementation of Jim Crow laws in the U.S. South, mandating racial segregation in public facilities. Southern states enacted laws specifically designed to prevent African Americans from voting. A campaign of violence and lynchings, primarily targeting African American men, was taking place through the country, and particularly the South, but just wasn't African Americans. The legal system in the South was often stacked against black citizens, with former Confederate soldiers serving as police and judges. This is a display from a museum down on 5th Avenue and 91st Street, the Gilded Age, Gilded New York. The billionaires. Well, they weren't billionaires then, but they would be billionaires today. The Gilded Age in the United States, and they are characterized by the immense industrial growth, technological advancements, and a widening gap between the rich and poor. Does that sound familiar? The widening gap between the rich and poor?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. The period saw a boom in factory jobs, attracting both domestic workers from rural areas and immigrants from abroad. While industrialists amassed enormous wealth, laborers often faced stagnant wages amidst rising prices for basic needs like food, housing, and health care. The wealthiest 1% of the population owned 51% of the wealth, while the top 12% owned 86% of the wealth. In contrast, the lower 44% of the U.S. population, nearly half the country, had only 1.2% of the wealth. Well, there's also this, the Henry Cabot Lodge Bill. And this bill was designed to protect African American men. Remember, only men could vote, whether they were white or African American. Women could only vote in the state of Wyoming as of 1891. It was all males. Which is better than just landowners, which occurred until the mid-1850s. The Lodge Bill of 1890, or the Federal Elections Bill, was a proposed bill to ensure the security of elections for U.S. representatives. It was drafted and proposed by Representative Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, sponsored in the Senate by George Frisbee Hoar of Massachusetts, with the endorsement of President Benjamin Harrison and all Republicans. But it never came to pass. He wants the bill passed, but he didn't. The bill was created primarily to enforce the ability of blacks, predominantly Republican at the time, to vote in the southern United States as provided by the Constitution. 15th Amendment had already guaranteed that right, but white Southern Democrats had passed laws restricting voter registration and instituting electoral requirements, such as requiring payment of poll taxes. By the way, poll tax, it was still in effect through 1963. 1964, there was a constitutional amendment eliminating the poll tax in your lifetime. In your lifetime. And literacy tests that effectively prevented blacks from voting. After passing the House by just 6 votes, it went to the Senate for approval. Congress convened on December 1st, 1890. The President, in his message, argued at some length in favor of the force bill and urgently recommended its passage. On December 3rd, the Senate resumed consideration of the force bill. The bill was debated from time to time until the holidays come in. This is the senator from Rhode Island, Nelson Aldrich. And on January 20th, 1891, he moved to take up the resolution in the Senate, previously introduced by him, amending the rules of the Senate as to cut off debate at the will of the remainder of that session. The object of Aldrich and his associates who were in favor of the force bill was to end the debate so that the majority could pass the force bill at will. There was a March 4th deadline to pass the bill. The bill died, so there's no protection. Who's to blame? Well, this guy, Levi P. Morton. He's the Vice President of the United States. He's Benjamin Harrison's Vice President. But he doesn't do enough to arm twist senators to pass the bill, and Harrison's really fuming about that. The Lodge bill was successfully filibustered by the Democrats in the Senate with little action by the President of the Senate, who happened to be the Vice President of the United States, Levi P. Morton, because silver Republicans in the West traded away for Southern support of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, and Northern Republicans traded away for Southern support of the McKinley Tariff. All came down to money. People in the West and the farmers dumped more money into print money, but you didn't have to print money, just produce more silver. 16 pieces of silver equals 1 piece of gold. Dump it into the economy. It'll inflate the economy, but it'll help out the farmers. Meanwhile, the Northern Republicans said, hey, you guys in the South, why don't you help us here with the McKinley Tariff? It'll bring a lot of money in. Now let me say one thing about the tariffs. Prior to 1890, most of the federal government, if not all the federal government's budget, was covered by tariffs. But that started in 1783. There was no income tax during those days, so it was all tariffs. That's how the government funded itself. The Republican Party's commitment to African American rights had already been declining since Reconstruction ended in 1877, and even before that, because there was a depression in 1873, and people were more worried about money than African American rights. And the 1890 Lodge Bill proved to be the last relic of the Republican commitment to civil rights. And then you have the Mississippi legislature. On November 1st, 1890, Mississippi adopted a new constitution with a poll tax and arbitrary literacy tests for voting, sections designed to disenfranchise newly franchised African Americans and some poor whites. You can't read this, well, you can't vote. You can't vote if you can't read, unless you give us some money, and then we might let you vote. Politicians in Washington took notice. In Congress, there was not much appetite to allow black men to vote without obstacles, even though the President Benjamin Harrison wanted the bill to be passed. How many in here have heard of Rosa Parks, the Montgomery boycott, 1955? Well, before there was Rosa Parks, there were 3 other women in Montgomery in 1955 who were refused seats on the bus, who were arrested. Rosa Parks was merely the most famous of the four. Before them, there was Irene Morgan in 1944, who had a miscarriage and was going from Virginia to Baltimore to see her doctor, and she refused to give up her seat. She took her case to the Supreme Court. She won, but even though the Supreme Court ruled in her favor that buses needed to be desegregated, the South didn't bother. Well before those incidences, there was this woman, Ida B. Wells. It's 1884. Ida B. Wells was fired from her job as a teacher in a segregated school in Memphis, Tennessee, for writing about issues of race and politics in the South for various publications. She was a vocal critic of the condition of segregated schools in Memphis. She was a civil rights leader in a time where very few people had taken on the challenge. And she was an African-American woman. African-American women, they're supposed to know their place in society. While on a train ride from Memphis to Nashville, Tennessee, in May 1884, Wells bought a first-class ticket, but the train crew forced her to move to the car for African Americans. She refused on principle before being forcibly removed from the train. As she was being removed, she bit one of the crew members. Wells sued the railroad, and she won $500, which today would be about $16,400. It's a settlement in a circuit court case. The decision was overturned by the Tennessee Supreme Court. It would be the start of her activism for colored people. And this year she's on the back of a quarter. We'll talk more about that in a bit. Okay, if you're a woman, 1891, this is from the Henry Ford Museum, a poster in the Henry Ford Museum, which is more than a car museum and more than an Americana museum. It's also a civil rights museum. Women's rights denied. The men don't have to listen to this if they don't want. Women do. 1880s, American women had fewer rights than a male inmate in an insane asylum. Women could not vote. They could not serve on the jury, testify in court, hold public office, attend college, practice law. If a woman were married, it was illegal for her to sign a contract. How many married women are here? So could you sign a contract?
Yeah.
You couldn't then. You couldn't own property or inherit property unless you were super rich like Martha Washington. Keep or invest her own earnings. How would you like to have somebody say, give your earnings to a guy? Father, husband, brother, uncle. Would you like that? That was life in the 1880s. Have automatic rights to her children in case of a divorce. Give the men the children. Women were expected to center their lives around family and home. Obey their husbands in all matters. How many of you obeyed your husband in all matters? That is derisive laughter. Not voice strong opinions in public. Couldn't say what's on your mind in public. How many of you would have abided by that? Behave in a refined, polite way. Well, what is a refined and polite way? I don't know. Maybe you could tell me. The National American Women's Suffrage Association was trying to convince power people to let women vote. President Benjamin Harrison, though, stayed silent on the women's right to vote issue. That was something that did not concern him. He just wanted the men to vote. No country allowed women voting, so there was a global push to get women the right to vote. Not one country in the world allowed women to vote in 1891. Think of that. The newly formed Social Democratic Women's Movement in Germany focused on economic freedom and equal pay, becoming a large and radical socialist movement in Europe. The women's suffrage petition in Victoria, Australia, petition signed by more than 30,000 Victorian women advocating for the women's right to vote on equal terms with men, was tabled by the Victorian Parliament in September. But there is a little ray of hope here. Wyoming was the first territory in 1869 and a state in 1890 to grant women the right to vote. Women in Kansas were able to vote in municipal elections starting in 1887. The Utah Territory gave women the right to vote in 1870, but Congress in 1887 said, "You're not going to vote. We don't want you to vote." And that was that. Illinois granted women the right to vote for school officials in 1891. That was it. Now I'm going to ask you a question here. Should women vote? Yes or no?
Yes, of course.
How many say yes? How many want to not eat dinner with anybody in this place anymore by saying no? The Immigration Act of 1891. The Immigration Act of 1891. This is a drawing or a picture of people coming over to America by boat. The United States wanted to stop immigration from China and from the South and Eastern Europe, as those immigrants were deemed undesirable for numerous reasons. How many of you have ancestors from Eastern or Southern Europe? East and Southern Europe, be Italy, Greece, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Russia. Nobody has any relatives from those areas? You do. You do. Okay, the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was passed on May 6th, 1882, was the first in a series of race and class-based legislation that resulted in the expulsionary measures against Chinese immigrants. Thank you for building the railroad. Now get out. Same thing in Canada, by the way. Thank you for building the railroad. Get out. Go back. I had a friend, the late Robert Lee, who never saw his mother. His mother was kicked out of Canada. His father was there, but he never saw his mother. She went back to China when he was little, never saw her again. Before he passed away, he tried to sue the Canadian government for X amount of dollars because the Exclusion Act in Canada. Anyway, America was changing demographically, and some Americans didn't want to see that. But Harrison had an immigration vision. He lays the groundwork for immigration reform in his inaugural speech on March 4th, 1889. And this is what he said: "Our naturalization laws should be so amended as to make the inquiry into the character and good disposition of persons applying for citizenship more careful and searching. Our existing laws have been in their administration an unimpressive and often unintelligible form. We accept the man as a citizen without the knowledge of his fitness, and he assumes the duties of citizenship without any knowledge as to what they are. The privileges of American citizenship are so great, and its duties so grave, that we may well insist upon the good knowledge by him of our institutions." Notice he's saying him, no women, not talking about women. "We should not cease to be hospitable to immigration, but we should cease to be careless as to the character of it. There are men of all races, even the best, whose coming is necessarily a burden upon our public revenues or a threat to societal order. These should be identified and excluded." Well, the way immigration worked then was basically, if the United States had a treaty with another country, you can come and go as they please. Some states started putting up barriers, but it was pretty easy to get into the country. But it was easy for people of Western Europe. That's who they wanted, the people of those days. They didn't want Southern or Eastern Europeans, and certainly not Asians or Chinese. The Immigration Act 1891 centralized immigration enforcement authority in the federal government, overriding state government's previous responsibilities to carry out federal immigration laws. The act also extended immigration inspections to land borders, Ellis Island, I'll talk about that in 1 second, created the Office of Superintendent of Immigration to supervise new immigration inspections at points of entry within the Treasury Department, which was charged with overseeing the Chinese Exclusion Act. The 1891 Act also placed further regulations on contract labor and expanded the list of excludable and deportable immigrants to include any of these fit your relatives: felons, polygamists. That was a big deal. Utah had polygamy. And then all idiots, insane persons, paupers are persons likely to become a public charge, as well as those suffering from infectious diseases, particularly eye diseases. The office's inspectors took on many duties formerly held by custom officials, such as gathering ships' passenger list and determine and recorded immigrants' admissibility. I used to speak on cruise ships before COVID-19, and I used to speak on the Holland America lines. And one of the speakers that I saw in Holland America was a Holland American historian who was hired by the company, worked his way through the ranks, and he said ships like Holland America used to carry immigrants from Europe to the United States. And there were three classes of people coming over. One was first class. He paid a lot of money. Second class paid a lot of money. Third was steerage. Lowest on the bottom, steerage. And they never got out of steerage. That's how people were considered. And the people in steerage was the one that they wanted to talk to, because they figured if you had money for a first or second class passenger berth, then you weren't going to be a problem. But immigrants did provide problems for some people. Italian immigrants lynched in New Orleans. Okay, so I take it that most of you never heard of the Colossus Massacre? I guess none of you have. That's okay. Nobody else has either, except if you were in New Orleans. Okay, it's March 14th. A mob of tens of thousands of angry men surrounded the New Orleans jail, shouting angry slurs, calling for blood. By the time they were done, 11 men would be dead, shot and mutilated in an act of brutal mob violence that took place in front of a cheering crowd. Let me tell you one thing about lynching in those days. Lynching could bring in 4,000 or 5,000 people to watch a lynching. And after the guy was dead, and it's mostly women, mostly African Americans, but some whites, after they were dead, they cut them down, and the ghouls would come over and cut up the body and keep some of the body pieces for souvenirs. That's what they were doing in the 1890s and the 1900s. The 11 men were Italian Americans. It began with the murder of David Hennessy. The New Orleans police chief was shot by gunmen while walking home from work. As he lay dying, a witness asked him who did it. Hennessy reportedly whispered a slur for Italians. New Orleans at the time was home to more Italian immigrants than any other southern state. And this is a drawing. These are the people who have come out to the jail, and they are going to attack the jail to go after the 11 that have been arrested. Those immigrants were not welcomed by New Orleans residents. Though Italians had been living in New Orleans since before the Louisiana Purchase, their language and customs were considered foreign and even dangerous by some. There was a great deal of white Southerner animosity toward Italians who were immigrants and often refused to abide by the Jim Crow laws. In other words, they were welcoming to African Americans. David Hennessy's assassination and dying accusation fanned the flames of anti-Italian sentiment in New Orleans. Police rounded up hundreds of Italians, even those who didn't seem to be associated with the attack. Local papers fueled the fire, demanding justice and declaring 9 men who were arrested on suspicion of a connection to the murder guilty before they were even tried. And again, this is the mob waiting to break into the jail. When news spread that the trial had resulted in 6 not guilty convictions and 3 mistrials, the city went wild. Thousands of angry residents gathered near the jail. Impassioned speakers whipped up the mob into a frenzy, painting Italian immigrants as criminals who needed to be driven out of the city. Finally, the mob broke into the city's arsenal, grabbing guns and ammunition. It is going to be their revenge. A small group of armed men stormed the prison, grabbing not just the men who had been acquitted or given a mistrial, but several who had not been tried or accused in the crimes. Shots rang out. 11 men's bodies were riddled with bullets torn apart by the crowd. Outside the jail, the larger mob cheered. The mutilated bodies were displayed. Some of the corpses were hanged. What remained of others were torn apart and plundered for souvenirs. America, 1891. Italian immigrants lynched in New Orleans. This is another drawing of it. The lynch mob was composed of some of New Orleans' most prominent residents. They were not punished. Some Americans swept on the tide of anti-immigration sentiment and applauded the killings. An editorial in the New York Times. Editorial in the New York Times called the victims desperate ruffians and murderers. These sneaking and cowardly Sicilians, the descendant of bandits and assassins, are to us a pest without mitigations. That's what the New York Times called them. The real identity of Hennessy's murderer was never determined. Italy threatened to end diplomatic relations with the United States. Benjamin Harrison would have to come up with a solution. The lynchings were widespread, around the United States, particularly in the South, and affected both white and black individuals. While the New Orleans lynchings received international attention, the majority of the lynchings targeted African Americans as a means of social control. The Tuskegee Institute, in the year 1891, recorded a total of 184 lynchings. If you do the math, that's one every other day. 71 white victims, including the 11, and 113 black victims. Lynchings those days, just an everyday part of America. Meanwhile, Jews became too successful in Moscow, way too successful in Moscow, and something had to be done. When the Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich became the Governor General of Moscow, he named one of his goals as to being to save Moscow from the Jews. An imperial decree was announced on March 28, ordering the expulsion from the city and government of Moscow of all Jewish artisans, brewers, and distillers. Jews had a long history of facing anti-Semitism in Russia, so this was absolutely nothing new. Persons who were born in Moscow and who knew no other place of residence were obliged to go to search for a new home. Some 20,000 Jews were expelled from the city in a short order. Poor Jews, well, they were sent to the Pale of Settlement, which is modern-day Belarus, Lithuania. I think my wife's grandmother came from Lithuania. Poland, my grandfather and others came from that area. Ukraine, another grandfather came from there. Latvia, and Western Russia on criminal transports, and there were large rewards offered to those who caught Jews hiding in the city. The newly built Chorale Synagogue, opened a year prior, was ordered closed, in addition to 8 other synagogues of the 14 in Moscow. Some Jews ended up going to Hamburg and decided to get on a ship, one of those cross-Atlantic crossings, offerings, and tried to get into the United States. And some of them did. The Baltimore incident, nothing happening in Baltimore, Maryland. This is the ship, the Baltimore. And it's when the United States begins flexing its foreign policy muscle under Benjamin Harrison. Benjamin Harrison would be the guy that Theodore Roosevelt looked up to as President of the United States, believe it or not. He'd look at Benjamin Harrison and start using some of Harrison's policies during his presidency, which was about 10 years later. The Baltimore crisis was a diplomatic incident that took place between Chile and the United States after the Chilean Civil War as a result of the growing American influence in the Pacific Coast region of Latin America. It marked a dramatic shift in the United States-Chile relations. It was triggered by the fatal shooting of 2 United States Navy sailors from the USS Baltimore in front of the True Blue Saloon in Valparaiso on October 16. The U.S. Navy had become the most powerful Navy in the Americas. The captain of the USS Baltimore allowed his men shore leave at Valparaiso. There was growing animosity against Americans as the Harrison administration openly backed the Chilean president, Jose Manuel Balmaceda in his battle with the Chilean Congress. The rift turned into a civil war. In August, Balmaceda resigned, fled, gained asylum in Argentina after forces loyal to him had suffered 2 defeats near Valparaiso. The U.S. minister to Chile then gave political asylum to some of Balmaceda's supporters. The Baltimore incident. America is not going to take this lying down. The new Chilean government initially rejected American protests. It denied responsibility, and the foreign minister attacked Harrison's demand of $75,000, $26 million today in reparations. He issued an ultimatum, hinted at war. European powers favored Chile, but recognized that America was dominant in the region and decided, you know what, we're not getting involved. Argentina and Peru had their own grievances against Chile, supported the U.S. In January 1892, Chile capitulated to Washington's terms, apologized, $75,000 in gold, $26 million today, ends up in Washington. Now, Native Americans or First Nations, what to do with the people, the indigenous people, who had the land prior to the white settlers from Europe, whether they be French, Spanish, or English. It's a boarding school. Kidnap the children, send them to boarding school. And that was the policy in both the United States and Canada. In March, Congress authorized the Commissioner of Indian Affairs to make and enforce by proper means such rules and regulations as will secure the attendance of Indian children of suitable age and health at schools established and maintained for their benefit. In other words, we're going to strip your culture, we're going to strip your language, we are going to Americanize you, or British you, well, it's Canadian by this point, Canada. The primary object of civilizing or assimilating Native American children and youth into the Anglo-American culture. In the process, these schools denigrated American Indian culture and made children give up their language and their religion. Federal government worked in tandem with religious organizations to send hundreds of Native American children to 2 off-reservation boarding schools, thousands of miles away from their families and operating inside a structure dedicated to the eradication of their identities. The boarding school system used children as pawns in the federal government's overall strategy to destroy Native American communities through a policy of assimilation. The schools prohibited the children from speaking their tribal language, required them to wear American-style dress and hairstyles, and made them give up their Native American religions for Christianity. In addition to standard academic lessons in subjects like reading, writing, and math, students learned trades that were marketable in American society, such as carpentry for boys and housekeeping for girls. You know what? Thinking back on my 9th and 10th grade education, I would have been better off in home economics than shop. Because I still don't know how to boil an egg. I don't know how to do that. But here's, these are the kids taking off their land, their reservation, sent to schools thousands of miles away. This was nothing new. As early as the mid-1600s, a smattering of missionaries worked to establish religious schools across New England, intentionally placing those institutions near indigenous communities in an effort to further spread Christianity and destabilize Native culture. And then there was the Wounded Knee Massacre, which came back in your lifetimes in the 1970s with demonstrations in South Dakota. The congressional action would come a little more than 2 months after the Battle of Wounded Knee. The Wounded Knee Massacre took place on December 29, 1890, near Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. The United States military slaughtered approximately 150 to 300 Lakota Sioux people. The massacre was the climax of the U.S. Army's late 19th century efforts to repress the indigenous people of the Great Lakes. 2/3 of Lakota victims were women and children. 25 United States servicemen were killed, mostly fell because of friendly fire. Now, this is about 8 years ago. I was up near Sudbury, Ontario, and we went to First Nations demonstration of their interpretation of history, which is not very much different than the interpretation of history in the United States. It's the same. Literally it's the same. Canadian Indian boarding schools. In Canada, there was also a boarding school policy for First Nations or Native Americans. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada documented 1891 residential school principles stating that the teaching of the gospel and promoting a better life compensated for the injustices of robbing and half-starving indigenous people. There was a belief that European country and Christianity were superior and that indigenous peoples needed saving as a idea. It was to preserve them at the time and was used to justify the forced removal of children from their families and communities. School, often run by churches, subjected indigenous children to various forms of abuse, neglect, and cultural destruction. Well, Benjamin Harrison did not want to see forests destroyed, and he does something about it. He is the first president who you could call a conservational president in the United States. He loved the outdoors. 3 times he visited Yellowstone National Park, the first park created in 1872. March 3rd, Congress passed the Forest Reserve Act, granting the president the power to establish national reserves. Harrison set aside land in Wyoming to form the nation's first forest reserve. The Shoshone National Forest was one of the first nationally protected areas anywhere, excuse me. Meanwhile, you want to go to the movies and watch a movie? Well, you'd have to go to a place that had one of these gadgets. It was called the kinetoscope, and they really weren't available much in 1891. In 1888, Edison announced that he envisioned an instrument which does for the eye what the phonograph does for the ear, and first used the term kinetoscope. However, his early attempts to record images on a photograph-style cylinder proved to be unsuccessful, until an encounter with E.J. Maury in Paris in 1889 pointed the way towards sequential images recorded on a strip moved intermediately in front of a single lens, a narrow strip with a single row of perforations. The team that Edison assigned to this work on the project was headed by W.K.L. Dixon and included Charles A. Brown, William Hayes, and occasionally Frederick Ott and Eugene Lustig. Exactly when the kinetoscope first emerged and who played the most important part in development has been a matter of controversy. Nobody knows. But it came out to be this. Edison set the goal and supported the research until its successful conclusion is not in dispute, even if it was his custom to claim a personal role in all the inventions carried out in his organization for patent reasons. Now, what was the kinetoscope? Basically, it was a device like that. At this podium, had stuff inside, and had people. You look down at that, and that's what the movie was. It showed a film loop lit by electricity and activated by an electric motor, and it makes its debut on May 20th. It was demonstrated by Edison at the meeting of the National Federation of Women's Clubs. The device was both a camera and a peephole viewer. The film used was 18 millimeters wide. A patent for the kinetoscope, the camera, and the kinetoscope, the viewer, was filed on August 24th. That would be the start of the American movie industry. Okay, how many baseball fans are here? Baseball fans? 1. Okay, all right. Well, this is about baseball, but it's not all about baseball. It's a look at society in 1891. The end of the Beer and Whiskey League. The inaugural American Association season started on May 2nd, 1882. Teams in 6 cities, Baltimore, Cincinnati, Louisville, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, when it had the H. I'll tell you about the H in a few minutes. St. Louis. Events leading to the association's opening day can be traced to the National Leagues expulsion of the Cincinnati franchise after 1880. Among the reasons for throwing out the Red Stockings were that the club permitted use of its grounds for semi-pro games on Sundays. They charged 50 cents, about $16 today admission, and sold alcoholic beverages inside the park. This was a very Victorian America. The blue laws on Sunday. Don't really do anything on Sunday. The only place around in this vicinity that still has blue laws is Paramus, New Jersey. None of the stores are open in Paramus, New Jersey. And the residents are very happy about that because of the Route 17, Route 4 intersection there. There's no traffic on Sunday. It's the only day of the week there's no traffic. It's heavy traffic the rest of the time. Alcoholic beverages. You're selling alcohol at a baseball game? What's wrong with you? You can't sell alcohol at a game. During the winter of 1881-82, the Cincinnati Club joined with teams in 5 other cities to form the American Association. The Whiskey and Beer League, or the Beer and Whiskey League, was a derisive term referring to the American Association. It was used by supporters of the National League in reference to the fact that many of the big backers were breweries and distilleries to put the league down. We don't like that. We don't like that at all. It's beer and whiskey money. And you got to remember what else is going on in the country at this time. This is the Cincinnati team of the time. The American Association included teams in cities located on or near the Ohio River, such as Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, and Louisville. These cities were disparagingly referred to by people who were involved or rooted for the National League as river cities. River cities. Bad people live in river cities. That was the prevailing thought in those days. The American Association had lower morality or social standards. The river towns were associated with rough characters, drinking, gambling, general lack of refinement. The American Association, they allowed games on Sunday and sold alcohol. So they were no good. In the 19th century, many areas of the United States had some form of blue laws. How many of you know about blue laws? Just one. Blue laws basically said, go to church on Sunday, don't do anything else. It's the day of the Lord. Respect the Lord. No, you can't do commerce, can't do this, can't do that. Basically, blue laws. Anyway, so many areas of the country have blue laws restricting activities on Sunday, generally aimed at promoting Christian Sabbath observance. These laws originated in colonial America, traditionally prohibited various commerce activities and other forms of labor to encourage rest and religious observation. There was also the women's temperance group, the Carrie Nation, who wanted to rid the country of saloons. So how do you get to this place, Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. The music hall opened on May 5th, and it was a landmark event in New York's cultural life. Andrew Carnegie, the steel baron and philanthropist, put up money that made the construction possible. The building cost was $1.1 million, almost $39 million today. And the opening concert featured Tchaikovsky. The building was designed by the architect William Burnett Tuthill, who paid particular attention to acoustics. And there's Carrie Nation. The end of the beer league, the Beer and Whiskey League attracted a larger working class fan base, contributed to its image as a more permissive and accessible league compared to the National League, which did not sell alcoholic beverages to its games. The National League owners seemed to have the temperance movement in mind with the banning of alcoholic beverages at its ballpark. The temperance movement was a social movement that began in the early 19th century, advocating for the reduction and outright prohibition of alcoholic consumption, the Beer and Whiskey League. By 1891, the American Association owners had faced significant financial problems. In the mid and late 1880s, some of its teams left, joined the National League. The Brooklyn team, the predecessor of the Brooklyn Dodgers. Any Brooklyn Dodger fans here? Back then. Won the American Association Championship in 1899. 1890, the team joined the National League and won the league championship. The most significant blow to the AA was dealt by the Players League, a third major league in 1890, which siphoned off talent and gate receipts. The American Association owners gave up. The league formally dissolved on December 18th, 11:10 a.m., officially merged with the National League. The new name was the National American Association of Baseball Clubs. 4 AA teams were added to the National League: the Baltimore Orioles, the Louisville Colonels, the St. Louis Browns, and the Washington Senators. The owners of the Boston Reds, Columbus Solons, Milwaukee Brewers, and Philadelphia Athletics took buyouts and were disbanded. Well, there's the ball, there's the basket, the peach basket and the soccer ball, and you play basketball, 2 words. December 21st, James Naismith introduces the first game of basketball. Based on 13 rules created by Naismith, the game is tested by 18 students at the International Young Men's Christian Association Training School in Springfield, Massachusetts. 2 teams of 9 players competed against each other. The object: throw a soccer ball into a peach basket 10 feet above the floor. 1890, Naismith, who was born in British North America in the colony of the province of Canada, moved from his job in Montreal as McGill University's athletic director to become a physical education teacher at the YMCA International Training School. Bored and unruly students needed an activity during difficult New England winters, right in the middle of Massachusetts, Springfield. Luther Gulick, the head of the physical education department at the International YMCA Training School in Springfield, persuaded Naismith to create an indoor game that could be played during the winter between the football and baseball seasons. And there is Gulick. He addressed the need for a new indoor game, one that would be interesting, easy to learn, easy to play in the winter, and by artificial light. No one in the class had followed up on Gulick's challenge to invent such a game, but now faced with the end of the fall sports season and students dreading the mandatory and dull required gymnastics work, Gulick had a meeting. And by the end of the faculty meeting, told Naismith, "Naismith, I want you to take that class and see what you can do with it." Well, Naismith's charge was to create a game that was easy to assimilate, yet complex enough to be interesting. It had to be playable indoors, or any kind of ground, and by a large number of players at once. Each should provide plenty of exercise without the roughness of football, soccer, or rugby. Anybody play duck on a rock? I never did. Never heard of duck on a rock?
No.
Apparently the game of basketball is partly based on duck on a rock. I never played duck on a rock. I don't know if anybody's ever played duck on a rock. Naismith took the elements of other games. From American rugby, there was passing. From English rugby, the jump ball. From lacrosse, the use of a goal. From soccer, the shape and size of the ball. From duck on a rock, a game Naismith played with his childhood friends in Benny's Corners, Ontario, a ball and a goal that could not be rushed. The goal could not be slammed through, thus necessitating a goal with a horizontal opening high enough so the ball would have to be tossed into it rather than thrown. Somehow he got that from the game Duck on a Rock. The peach basket, well, they didn't know what to do, so go get a peach basket. He approached the school janitor, hoping he could find 2 18-inch square boxes to use as a goal. The janitor came back with 2 peach baskets instead. Naismith nailed them to the lower rail of the gymnasium balcony, one at each end. The height of the lower balcony rail happened to be 10 feet. A man was stationed at the each end of the balcony to pick up the ball from the basket, put it back into play. Had to climb a ladder to get it. I called the boys to the gym, divided them into teams of 9, and gave them a little soccer ball. Naismith recalled in a 1939 radio interview that aired on WOR-AM, New York City. In the radio business, WOR is referred to as world's oldest radio. I showed them 2 peach baskets I nailed to each end of the gym. Told them the idea was to throw the ball into the opposing team's peach basket. I blew a whistle, and the first game of basketball began. Now, anybody ever hear of drop the handkerchief? Women never drop the handkerchief. Remember in the movies, a woman would drop a handkerchief if she wanted the man to come back? Remember those scenes in movies? Yeah, you do? Well, drop a handkerchief. What's that got to do with basketball? The invention of basketball is not an accident. It was developed to meet a need. Those boys simply would not play drop the handkerchief. The game was born. Now, dropping the handkerchief was a Victorian-era social custom where a woman would intentionally drop her handkerchief in front of a guy she was interested in as a subtle invitation for him to approach and initiate a conversation or courtship, given the social constraints of a woman initiating contact. You know how I met my wife? She looked right in my face. I didn't know she was blind as a bat. And she looked at me and she says, "What's a guy like you, looking like you, doing in a place like this?" It's one hell of a pickup line, huh? She didn't drop a handkerchief. Didn't at all. Okay, how many of you have been in this town, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania? Okay, you have. How do you spell Pittsburgh? Pittsburgh.
Yes.
But if you did that on a test in 1891, you'd be wrong. The H is gone. Now, why would the H be gone in Pittsburgh? Well, the United States Board on Geographical Names adopted 13 general principles to be used in standardizing place names, one of which was the place names ending in B-U-R-G-H. Drop the final H. At the time, the city was renamed Pittsburgh. That doesn't even look right, does it, Pittsburgh? The board supported its decision to rename Pittsburgh by referencing printed copies of the 1816 city charter, which featured the spelling Pittsburgh without the H rather than Pittsburgh. The locals would start a 20-year fight to get back their H. And they would get back their H. The legacy, that's Benjamin Harrison. The McKinley tariffs, which Benjamin Harrison supported, led an economic downturn that would in part cause the panic or depression of 1893. Workers would start going on strike, and there would be violent responses to workers' actions starting in 1892. This is a museum in Mobile, Alabama. Colored entrance only, and then underneath that says Private Joe Lewis says that blacks or colored people join the Army. The president, Benjamin Harrison, blamed Levi P. Morton for his failure to get the Lodge Bill passed through Congress. Harrison would dump Morton as his running mate in 1892 when he ran for re-election as president. A unanimous Supreme Court vote on April 25, 1898 upheld Mississippi's claim that their constitution was not discriminatory. States with constitutions with similar voter suppression statutes adopted by South Carolina, 1895, Louisiana, 1898, North Carolina, 1900, Alabama, 1901, Virginia, 1901, Georgia, 1908, Oklahoma, 1910, so you could discriminate. The poll tax, eliminated in 1964 by a constitutional amendment. This is Ida B. Wells. How much do you know about Ida B. Wells? Anything? Well, 1896, Wells formed several civil rights organizations, including the National Association of Colored Women. After brutal attacks on the African American community in Springfield, Illinois in 1908, Wells took action. In 1909, she attended a conference for an organization that would later become the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. 89 years after her death in 2020, Wells was awarded a Pulitzer Prize for her outstanding and courageous reporting on the horrific and vicious violence against African Americans during the era of lynching. In 2025, and they've just come out, these coins. She was honored as an important woman in American society on the back of a quarter. It's the last of the series of women being highlighted on the backs of quarters. She is among the last group of 5 that will be honored. Votes for women, votes for women. Women in New Zealand gained the right to vote on September 19, 1893, when the electoral bill was signed into law by Governor Lord Glasgow. This made New Zealand the first self-governing country in the world to grant national voting rights to women. Most, but not all, women got the right to vote in America in 1920. Native Americans couldn't vote until 1924. That was the year Native Americans became United States citizens. They were here before the country. It took them to 1924, the Snyder Act, before they could become citizens. William Howard Taft, we don't want immigrants. We don't want immigrants. In the early 1900s, U.S. immigration officials mistakenly thought that the peak wave of immigration had passed. By 1907, more than 1 million immigrants were processed. In 1924, the Reed-Johnson Act severely limited immigration, virtually shutting down America's door to Eastern and Southern Europeans. Chinese Exclusion Act repealed in 1943. As far as Columbus Day, it goes back to 1891 and the killing of the Italian Americans in New Orleans. The New Orleans lynchings fueled anti-Italian sentiment, strained the diplomatic relations between the United States and Italy. The Italian government demanded justice and reparations for the victims, families, and Italy recalled its ambassador in protest. In an effort to ease tensions, President Benjamin Harrison declared the first national celebration of Columbus Day in 1892. He also paid $25,000, about $883,000 in reparations to the victims' families. Columbus Day would become officially a federal holiday in 1968. Columbus is now viewed as a symbol of colonization, violence, and transatlantic slave trade. The Moscow Jews. The Jewish expulsion from Moscow, Russia, reached its climax during the cold winter days of 1892, which coincidentally was the year my grandfather was born, when the police made a concerted effort to search out the Jews and drive them out of the city. Generous rewards were given for the seizure of any still in hiding. Police sources estimated that about 30,000 persons were expelled, maybe 5,000 Jews remained. 1899, the authorities ordered no more Jewish merchants to be registered in the first guild unless authorized by the Minister of Finance. Jews were fleeing Europe, heading to the United States. Benjamin Harrison and the Navy. In 1888, the U.S. Navy did not have any battleships. President Benjamin Harrison recognized the need for a modern, powerful Navy to support America's commercial and international ambitions. His administration instituted a significant shipbuilding program. The thinking, without strong naval fleet ships, well, they were easy prey for pirates. There was also growing concern with defending our coastlines and shipping routes, threats of Chilean hostilities, European interventions. Harrison would expand America's global influence. Those ships used in the War of 1898, Spanish-American War. Roosevelt looked up to Harrison. Conservation, the Navy. In fact, he was in the Navy in 1898. The legacy of Native Americans. In February 1973, activists with the American Indian movement seized and occupied the Wounded Knee, South Dakota site for 71 days to protest the U.S. government's mistreatment of Native Americans. The standoff resulted in the deaths of 2 Native Americans. The rise of pan-Indian activism, tribal nations continuing, complaints about schools and studies led to the passage of the Indian Self-Determination and Education Act of 1975. It enabled tribes to establish reservation community schools. President Joe Biden designated the Carlisle Indian Institute School in Pennsylvania National Monument in December 2024. Meanwhile, Pope Francis went to Canada in 2022. On April 1st, during a meeting between the delegation of First Nations representatives and the Pope at the Vatican, Pope Francis apologized for the conduct of some members of the Roman Catholic Church in the Canadian Indian residential school system. During a July 2022 pilgrimage to West Canada, Pope Francis reiterated the apologies to the Catholic Church with hundreds of indigenous people and government officials in attendance for its members' role in administrating many of the residential schools on behalf of the government and for abuse that occurred at the hand of Catholic priests and religious sisters. Glacier National Park. Remember, Benjamin Harrison is the first president to put aside land, national land, to preserve. President Harrison used the Forest Reserve Act 17 times, setting aside in Colorado, including Pikes Peak, Oregon, California, Washington, New Mexico Territory, Arizona Territory, Alaska Territory, putting land aside. In 1907, forest reserves were renamed national forests. Harrison laid the groundwork for President Theodore Roosevelt's conservation policy between 1901 and 1909. Oh man, there's Fred Ott. How much would you pay to see this movie? It's called The Sneeze. Fred Ott. Oh, this is Fred Ott sneezing. Anyway, so that's Fred Ott. The premiere of the completed Kinetoscope was held at the Brooklyn Institute of Arts and Science, May 9, 1893. The first film publicly shown on the system was Blacksmith Scene or The Blacksmiths. Fred Ott's Sneeze, officially entitled Edison's Kinetoscopic Record of the Sneeze, is a short, silent, black and white film from 1894. Notable for being the first motion picture registered for copyright in the United States, one of the earliest surviving American motion pictures. By the way, it lasts all of 4 seconds. Shoot! It was the start of the motion picture industry. Carnegie Hall on the National Historic, as of National Historic Landmark. In October 1955, New York planner Robert Moses let it be known that an acre in Lincoln Square, Manhattan project would be set aside for a new concert hall for the New York Philharmonic. If the Philharmonic moved to a new home at the proposed Performing Arts Center, Carnegie Hall would lose more than 115 days of rent annually and would be crippled financially. Campaign to save the concert hall was started. People like Jack Benny were involved. Isaac Stern was involved. It was saved from the wrecking ball. Lincoln Center was built. Carnegie Hall was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1964, New York City Landmark in 1967. Sandy Koufax, Sandy Braun from Brooklyn, New York. There are 4 American Association franchises that join the National League that exist today. Pittsburgh Pirates, Cincinnati Reds, Los Angeles Dodgers, and St. Louis Cardinals. The National League owners, who thought that being the only big league baseball group in America would enrich them, were wrong. 1899, the league lost 4 franchises: the Baltimore Orioles, Cleveland Spiders, the Louisville Colonels, and the Washington Senators, leaving just 8 teams. National League would not add teams until 1990, when owners in Houston and New York got franchises: the Houston Colt 45s and the New York Metropolitans, better known as the New York Mets. It's the book I wrote about basketball, Peach Baskets, Dancing Halls, and the not-so-stern NBA. It took decades for basketball to catch on as a spectator sport. It would be the college game that would capture people's attention. Many professional leagues failed. The Harlem Globetrotters basketball team was more popular in the 1940s and 50s than the National Basketball Association. Today's NBA is worth billions of dollars and has become an international entity. And finally, we leave in Pittsburgh. And that's the old baseball park wall from Forbes Field. It is in the middle of the University of Pittsburgh. They left the wall as a reminder of Forbes Field, which was built in 1909 and was the first cement building ever. So they did get back their H. The Pittsburgh Gazette refused to adopt the United States Board on Geographic Names' decision to drop the H, as did the Pittsburgh Stock Exchange and the University of Pittsburgh. Official city documents continue to use the old spelling. Responding to mounting pressure, the board reversed its decision on July 19, 1911, and the Pittsburgh spelling was restored after 20 years of fighting. They got their H back. Anyway, thank you so much. Any questions? Any comments?